So, you think winning a Lorcana draft is all about just taking the best card, do you? Well, think again. Today, I'll be running down the top strategies to make sure you win your drafts every time. No more O3s here. From now on, you win. Welcome back, fellow Illumineers, to Be Our Guest. Today we are talking the top draft strategies to make sure that you win every time. I try not to take myself too seriously, but I'm serious today. I want to make sure that I'm not just giving you the best cards to take out of the draft. I want to make sure I'm hitting you with the strategies that you need throughout the draft and through the gameplay to make sure you take your deck every single time to that 3-0 victory. I'm going to be referencing draft a lot in this video, but for my sealed brethren out there, just know that a lot of this does apply to sealed, maybe not 100% of it. I will try and do a sealed specific video at some point in time. I don't anticipate before Fabled comes out, but I will try and cover that for you. But hopefully you'll stay tuned because I think a lot of this will apply as well. We're going to try and keep this tight today. Big difference from my hour-and-a-half long videos that you've been seeing from the draft set reviews. So, what are we talking about today? Ultimately, we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about the wants of the draft. We're going to talk about the needs of the draft. And we're ultimately going to talk about how we execute on this as a whole. So let's talk about those wants first. Because when you see a lot of these draft videos or limited videos, you'll usually see them referencing something called B.R.E.A.D. It is an acronym for the things that we're looking for when we're drafting. But I want you to consider this, that this is your want list. We're going to talk about the needs very soon, and for me, that is almost the most important part. But when we're talking about B.R.E.A.D, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about bombs, those kind of cards that take over a game. Think Tinkerbell, Giant Fairy. We want to talk about removal. Tinkerbell is that as well, but something like Strength of a Raging Fire would be your removal. Evasives, things like Genie Wish Fulfilled are your evasives. Aggro would be your aggressive cards, so things that are going to quest quickly to victory. That could be as simple as your 3-cost 3/3 2-lore Mickey True Friend, or something even more aggressive than that. And then card draw, right? I've said it many times, limited tends to get to a case of top deck, a case of battle of attrition where you wear each other down and are just living off the top of your deck. The longer that you can stave that off, the more cards you can draw to stave that off, the better off you'll be. But these are your wants. These are the things that are ideally going to be in your deck. However, this isn't an ideal situation. This is your best card situation. I alluded to this at the top of the video. Whenever you've got someone coming to you saying, I don't like Lorcana draft because it's just take the best card because you can play anything. To a degree, they're right, but that's in an ideal situation. That's where B.R.E.A.D is most useful. That's why often when we're talking about, theoreticals for draft, we're usually referring to pick one, pack one. My very first pack that I open, the first card that I'm going to take will almost always be the best card because I've got no other factors at play. But as you go through the draft, things change. What is the best card in pack 3 might not have been the best card out of that pack for you in pack 1. So that's where we're going to talk about the needs mostly today. So we'll have that B.R.E.A.D in the back of our mind as we talk through the needs, but the needs are the critical factor. And this is where I haven't really gotten into this up until now. When I've done my review videos, I've kind of treated it as pack 1 type thing. I'll reference other packs sometimes, right? Something gets better or worse later on in the draft. But for the most part, we're talking about ideal scenarios and what would just be the best card in a vacuum, right? But that's not the case. As you're going through the drafts, there's going to be a lot of factors that you need to keep in mind. And this is what's truly going to differentiate you from your competition, is the ability to balance these things. And the closest illustration that I could think of, closest metaphor I could think of, would be I want you to consider that there are 4 buckets in front of you. As you're drafting, there are 4 buckets in front of you that are alternatingly filling and reducing the amount of volume of liquid inside. Water, if you feel like you want to use that as the analogy, right? And there is a line on those buckets, which is your ideal state. And your goal is to end the draft once you've taken 48 cards and build your deck with each of those 4 buckets perfectly lined up with your ideal state. That's almost never going to happen in reality, but that's the goal, right? That would be the perfect draft, at least in terms of your drafting and ultimately your deck construction. So what are those 4 buckets? Well, the first one is your ink curve, your cost curve. We talk about this a lot, but it's something that not everyone knows how to balance. So cost curve is the first one. We're going to go into each in detail in a moment. Second one is inkability, right? Do I have too many uninkables, or have I not drafted enough such that maybe I left some value on the table where I maybe could have pushed the uninkability a little bit more and gotten value there? So that's the second one. Third one is functionality, and this kind of refers back to that B.R.E.A.D piece, which is, do I have the right amount of removal? Because you can have too much of card draw, of evasives, etc. This, you could consider this each of their own buckets, but it's really the functionality of your deck, right, as you go. And then the last one is the balance of aggressive versus controlling bodies. And again, we'll get into each in detail. What do I mean by that in a little bit? So let's go through one of these at a time. So let's start with the ink curve or the cost curve. Now, I've given you my ideal ink curves in some of my quick hit videos before. And also, you've probably seen other people give their ideal ink curve or cost curve that might look a little bit different or might be the same. Here's the thing. The ideal curve varies. This is kind of the challenge, right? Is trying to figure out what is the ideal curve right now. So for the most part, it varies by set, which is to say, if you've watched my review videos, you might have seen me reference that I think that Fabled, for example, the set we're coming up to, is going to be a slower set. The 1 and 2 drops aren't particularly good. There's enough removal that you can probably stall the board a bit, which means the game's probably going to go a bit longer, which means it's probably going to be slower. So as a result, knowing that the games are probably going to be longer, and as such, you can't afford to necessarily be as aggressive, have as many 1 and 2 drops in your deck, your curve might necessarily shift to more 3, 4, 5 drops, potentially more 6+ than I would normally recommend. Whereas for me, I normally recommend a lower ink curve. I normally recommend a faster, more aggressive ink curve. Not necessarily hyper aggressive, but more aggressive. So let me speak to what is usually the recommended ink curve that I give for in a vacuum, and how I think you might tweak that based on the situations of the set. So in a vacuum, usually I suggest between 4 and 6 1 drops, between 6 and 8 2 drops, between 8 and 12 3 drops, maybe 8 to 10 or 7 to 10 4 drops. Again, probably 6 to 8 or maybe like 5 to 7 5 drops, and then a similar amount of 6+ drops as your 1 drops. So in that kind of 3 to 5, 4 to 6 range. Now you'll notice I've already given you kind of a wide range. I said 4 drops, maybe 8 to 10 or 7 to 10 or something like that, right? Again, it's not a hard and fast rule. If your deck is more tweaked towards being more aggressive, you might shift a little bit lower. If your deck's more tweaked to being a little bit more top heavy, you might shift it higher. So there's no hard and fast rule, but what you need to determine is what is your play style and what is the set promoting in terms of an ideal curve. As I said, for Fabled, I think that we're probably going to shift more towards a higher curve. So maybe less 1 drops, right? Maybe we only have 3 to 4 1 drops, similar amount of 2 drops, but more 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6+, right? And then for your play style. So for me, again, I like to play a tempo game. So I like to have a little bit more aggressive ink curve. Whereas I know some, shout out Drew, that likes playing big bodies and likes going for the late game and is going to look to either potentially ramp or just hold off the game long enough that he gets to his big bodies and can take over the game as a result. So this is something you will learn with time, right? What is my play style more conducive to? In Constructed, I play much more a mid-range or control deck because that's what I'm comfortable with, and have a really challenging time with aggro. I don't feel I'm particularly good at it in Constructed. Whereas in Limited, I actually find that my playstyle tends to favor more of that. So for me, my own kind of discovery has been that my playstyles vary a little bit between Limited and Constructed. That might not be the case for you. But as you explore this, it will develop over time. But try and be aware of it. Be aware of, as you're playing out these games, where have your strengths been? Where have you been able to be most effective? When you're winning, what was your playstyle then? When you're losing, did your playstyle maybe change a little bit, right? So assess that as you go in terms of your playstyle, where the set's at, and that will tell you where your ideal ink cost is. So now, let's go back to our analogy of the buckets. As you're drafting the first 3, 4, 5, 6 picks, you should probably just be taking the best card. But as soon as you start getting even later into pack 1, and certainly into pack 2, 3, 4, you need to start being mindful of what you're drafting. So let me take 4-drops as an example. So 2 sets ago, I told you that the 4-drops were off the hook. So many great 4-drops. So you could find yourself in a position where your first 3, 4, 5 picks were all 4-drops because they were just so good. Oh my gosh, I got 2 fidgets, right? And 2 panics. Great. That will probably make your deck very good. But then, a little bit later in the pack, you see a pretty good 4-drop. But you see a card that may not be quite as good as that 4-drop, but is in another ink cost that maybe you don't have yet. And that's when you need to start prioritizing different costs. So, and this is going to be a kind of continual recommendation through the draft, through the video, is as you're going through the packs, try and get a sense of what percentage of my ideal end state am I at now? For example, if I want between 8 and 10 4-drops by the end of the draft, I probably shouldn't have more than 2 or 3 by the end of pack 1. If I have 5 by the end of pack 1, I need to hit the brakes on my 4-drops, right? If there's a 4-drop that's an absolute bomb, obviously you take it. But I really need to step back from the 4-drops and start fleshing things out. In a set where there is a limited number of good cards at a certain ink cost, this is where you could really fall behind. The 5-drops from last set, remember how thin the 5-drops were? It's like, okay, I'm into pack 2 and I've only got 1 5-drop. This is a problem. I need to prioritize the 5-drops. Maybe they're not as good as some of the other cards that I might want to take out of that pack. But there's enough, they're close enough that I need to prioritize the 5-drops. That close enough is where the experience comes in. And I can't tell you in any given situation what close enough is. You're going to have to determine that for yourself, and that's going to come with practice. But be mindful that you're trying to figure out what the close enough is, right? So that you're making conscious decisions and that you can then assess afterwards. Okay, as I was playing through this draft, and I made that decision between those 2 cards, how much different would my experience have been if that card was the other one, right? Sometimes a little bit hard to do, but just be conscious that you're trying to make that decision and assess as best you can afterwards, right? So as you're going through the draft, think about where your cost curve is, your ink curve is. By the end of pack 1, do I have, 1 or 2 1-drops, 1 or 2 6+, and kind of a commensurate curve so that if I multiply this by 4, by the end, I've got my ideal curve. Again, by the end of pack 1, you're probably not going to have an exact curve of all of these. You're going to have a few more of one cost than another, etc., than you would want to have by the end. So it's not like you have to have it perfect each pack, right? It's not like you got to stay on that ideal line through the whole draft. But you've got to make sure that as you go above that line and below that line, that eventually you kind of even out to that ideal line by the end of the draft. So that by the end, you've got that relatively clean curve from 1 to 2 up to kind of 3 or 4 at the peak and back down again. Next piece that we're looking at is inkability. This one should be a little bit easier, but it can get away from you. Which is to say, ideally, you don't want more than 4 to 6 uninkables at the end of the draft in your actual deck, right? You've got 8 cards that you can cut. Chances are a good chunk of those are going to be uninkables, right? You're stuck with a few at the end of each pack, right? So this is where I usually have, at least mentally, or if you're allowed to, at your draft, have a pile of cards that I'm planning on cutting. And so in each pack, if I'm cutting 8, I try not to have more than 2 cards that I absolutely intend to cut in the pile at the end of each pack. So if I'm stuck with 2 bad uninkables, okay, and I start piling up, and then I get to the point where pack 3, I've already got 7 cards that I want to cut that are uninkable, I got to get much more careful about my inkability. So it's not just a matter of the cards that you do want to play that are uninkable. You also have to be mindful of the cards you don't want to play that are uninkable, right? So as you're going through the draft, you're mindful of the cards that I intend to play and making sure I don't have more than 4 to 6 of those. So like 1 to 1.5 per pack, right? And then the cards that I don't want to play that are uninkable, making sure that I ideally don't have more than 2 of those per pack. Because the worst case scenario is you get to the end of the draft and you've got 9 uninkable cards that you absolutely don't want to play. Those 9 Fs, right? So that's not a situation you want to put yourself in, but likewise, you don't want to draft all these cards that you intend to play and they're all uninkable, right? You can push it, like I've pushed it up to 8 and been okay, but then you have to be very careful about your mulligan. And I once pushed it to 11 and that was a terrible idea and I shouldn't have won, but I got really lucky. Right? But 4 to 6 is your ideal. And I mentioned if you watch the 6-drop reviews, that if I've got a card like Second Star to the Right, very greedy uninkable card. For me, then, I almost want to have maybe 2 or 3 max uninkables, because I'm assuming that's going to be stuck in my hand for a while, and I can't afford to have too many uninkables stuck in my hand, right? So this is where that balance comes into play. I'll get to the gameplay a little bit later in terms of the inkability or not. But when you're drafting, that's the 2 things you need to factor in terms of inkability is the cards you do want to play and the cards you don't want to play. Functionality. So that one is back to that bread analogy, right? Bombs are going to be what they're going to be, but everything else we should be trying to control. I'm going to skip aggro for a second because that's going to come into our 4th point. But that 3rd bucket, really think about removal, evasives, and draw. I've mentioned it several times that in every set, there's bad answers to evasives. But if you're desperate, then you have to draft and play those bad answers to evasives, which then begs the question, was there an opportunity that I had earlier in the draft to get an evasive and not have to draft that bad answer? So this is where that bucket comes into play, right? The ideal state. So just talking about the evasives, for example, there might be an evasive, a Moana, 4 cost, 3/4 evasive, 1 lore. Nothing particularly exciting about her. You might have another card that's slightly better than Moana in the pack. But if you're into pack 2 and you've got no good answers to evasives, you should probably draft Moana, because it might not be quite as good as that other card, but it fills a need you haven't filled yet. You don't want to have to get to pack 4 and have to draft a bad answer to evasives, which is maybe substantially worse than another card you could have picked now in pack 4, because you just haven't drafted sufficient answers to evasives. Everyone seems to approach drafts thinking, well, obviously I'm going to draft a bunch of as many evasives as I can each time. But when you're faced with a situation where you've got kind of a low B Moana and there's a high B other card, you need to ask yourself, do I have enough answers to evasives? Again, first half of pack 1, you can probably just draft the best card and not worry about it. But as you start getting later in the draft, you need to make sure that you have good answers to evasives. Whether you're the threat, whether I've got the 2/3 2-lore evasives like Tinkerbell for 4, or whether you've got answers to the threats. I mentioned in my reviews, I prefer to be the threat than to have the answers to the threats, but one way or the other, you need to make sure that you don't get in a situation where your opponent can just quest or challenge with abandon because they've got the evasive ground, they've got the high ground like Obi-Wan, and you just are suffering on the ground. With removal, right? You can have a really good deck, but your opponent can still get away from you if you don't have ways to deal with them. So removal can be a really key part of making sure that you can keep that balance. So, again, seems obvious. Well, of course we're going to draft removal, but not all removal is great. So much like the evasives, can I make sure that I prioritize good removal if the card might not be quite as good as an alternative option? A really good character. Okay, this removal isn't quite as good on Heath's ranking chart, but again, it's pack 2, and I know that I don't have any removal yet, right? So that we don't have to get to the point where it's pack 4 and we take really bad removal, because there's plenty of it, right? And same with card draw. For the most part, card draw is usually pretty self-evident, but a card like Heal What Has Been Hurt, right? Not particularly exciting, but if there's a card that's slightly better than that, and you realize that you don't have any card draw yet, and that might be able to get you some value, then you need to make sure that you're prioritizing that. So the functionality of the deck is just making sure you've got a good balance. Now, again, you can have too much. As I alluded to at the start, you can have too much. If I just draft 10 pieces of removal and I don't have enough characters to actually be questing, that's not good, right? So if I start getting too heavy on removal, even evasives, right? Because evasives tend to be weaker bodies. So I remember I played with Drew, with our cube guru himself. I played a 2-player sealed with him, Chaos Sealed. And we gave him all the evasives just to go super aggro. And yet he actually lost a game because his opponent got slightly ahead of him and he had no way to catch up. He had no bodies to challenge with because they were all just aggressive bodies. And they were all small stats, right? So, same with evasives. You can actually have too much evasives. You can have too much card draw. You can lose the game with plenty of cards in hand because you weren't able to control the board. So, you can also have too much. Again, what is too much? That's hard to say because it's very much a case-by-case basis. But if you have those situations where you've thought you drafted really well, because I drafted all this great card draw that Heath told me to draft, and then you lose several games or even a couple of games with a ton of cards in your hand, that's your signal to maybe look at your deck afterwards and be like, do I have too much card draw in here? Removal. If you've got removal in your hand, but you've got no characters on the board, and this happens quite frequently, there's a good chance that you might have too much of that. What's the right balance? It's hard to say because it depends on a lot of factors in your deck, right? If I've got some big bodies in my deck, I might need less removal because I can challenge more. If I've got a lot of evasives in my deck, I might have a lot of card draw so that I can cannot run out of gas too early, which is to say, end up top decking again and not being able to quite get to 20, right? So these are different factors at play, but on the whole, I would say you probably want to have at least 32 to 35 characters in most decks, and then a handful of, hopefully some of those combine as both removal and card draw, right? And then a handful of actions to complement those as removal or card draw. If they're really good removal and really good card draw, you can certainly go a higher amount than that, but there is a point where you can have too much. And the last is balance of aggro and control bodies. And this is where most successful limited decks are what we like to call mid-range. Now, if you're new to what archetypes are in TCGs, typically there are 3 archetypes, 3 main archetypes. One is aggro or aggressive, right? All you're trying to do is turn your character sideways, quest to 20. Then there's control, which is I'm trying to completely control my opponent's board, such to the point that I just completely edge them out of the game and then can just quickly quest to 20, right? Think of the Ruby Sapphire decks in Constructed, right? Whereas the aggro decks are more of your Amber Steel aggro, or if you want to talk about hyper aggro, your Amber Amethyst aggro decks that occasionally popped up, right? Something like that. A mid-range deck is a deck that can pivot between being a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more controlling, depending on what deck they're playing against, right? And this is your ideal state for limited most of the time. Is, okay, if I'm on the play, I can probably mulligan in such a way that I have a little bit more of an aggressive start. I've got 1 into 2 into 3 into 4 into 5, and at least a couple or a few of those quests for 2, right? Versus control. I'm looking at having bigger stats for my cost so that I can challenge my opponent's characters, have my characters stay on the board, and then ultimately quest for victory once I've cleared their board and I've still got plenty of characters left, right? And then they have to control me back, right? So this is that balance, right? Because if you have a bunch of big bodies and they all only quest for one, your opponent might be able to be more aggressive than you and win out. If you've got nothing but those aggressive bodies, I mentioned with Drew's Evasives deck, it looked beautiful on paper, but it actually managed to lose one game because the opponent was able to be on the play and just slightly out aggroed them and they couldn't respond, right? So that's where you might want to pivot more towards those big bodies. So if you got a good balance of those, right, then you'll be all right. As I've said in my reviews, there are some cards that complement one style or the other. Bodyguards complement the aggressive style. Characters and abilities that increase strength, that allow you to challenge might benefit big bodies, right? Big willpower is benefited by cards that give plus strength. So the 1/4s of the world and the 2/5s of the world benefit from strength increase. So depending on where your deck is headed, you might benefit certain cards a little bit more than the other. So as you're going through the draft, I'm into pack 2 or 3. You need to be aware of what you've already drafted. I've drafted great cards, but am I drafting a lot of the aggressive cards? Okay, and you start getting some bodies, some bigger bodies. Am I drafting more of the big bodies? I got to get some lore questers in here, right? And balancing those two. It's not that balance doesn't mean a perfect 50-50. What is that ideal state? Again, it's going to depend on the cards. I usually find that having more of a 35-40% aggressive and a larger majority of challenging bodies is usually the ideal state for the decks that I have built, but it can absolutely pivot. So again, I wish I could give you a specific number, but it just doesn't exist. It's going to depend on the makeup of your deck, but just be mindful of that, right? When I'm on the play, am I able to a fair degree, be more aggressive? And when I'm on the draw, am I able to a fair degree, be more controlling? And can I balance and pivot between those? And if I find myself consistently in situations where either I'm falling behind or I just can't get ahead enough, then take a look at your deck and think, okay, what's the balance on this? And could I have maybe drafted a little bit differently to adjust that balance? This brings us back to a key point that I've brought up several times in my review videos, which is who is the quester? This is a really important concept for you to reflect on as you're drafting and as you're playing. So this is where we'll start getting into that kind of gameplay element of it, which is who is the quester? It's really important for you to understand as you're going through the turns, who is pushing the pace, which is to say, my opponent is at 6 lore and I'm at 0. I probably can't afford to quest for 3 and then pass it back to them, right? Then they quest 2-10 and it comes back to me. Now it's 10-3. So there will be a point where maybe your opponent has more lore, but not so much more that it, moves that needle too much. But speaking of needle, or we can say the bucket analogy, whatever you want to, there will come a point where it tips too far. So in that situation where your opponent's at 6, you're at 0, and you could quest for 3, or I could challenge and remove some of my opponent's characters, they are the quester. I might still quest, but I should be really focusing on controlling the board at this point. So if I'm playing cards that don't control the board, that's a problem, right? My opponent's at 6, and I'm at 0, and maybe I'm able to eliminate one of their characters, but maybe that's it. I can't be playing a 1-2 quest for 2, right? I can't even be playing a 3-3 quest for 2. At that point, I've got to be looking at some of the bigger stat bodies. And if I don't have them in my hand, and I don't have them in my hand consistently, and this keeps happening, then I haven't seen to that balance of aggro versus control characters, right? So this is where you've got to be mindful of, are they pulling away too much? right? Most of the time, most players I've seen are generally aware of that, but you need to be focused on it and thinking about is the cards that I'm playing and the things that I'm doing with my board, is that connected to who's the quester, right? Likewise, maybe I'm on the draw, but I get to a point where I'm actually able to start getting ahead on lore and forcing the issue with my opponent, right? In a world where they've got a 3/3 quest for 2 body on the board, and I've got a 3/3 quest for 2 body on the board, and theirs is exerted, and I could challenge them, but we're at the same amount of lore, or I'm 1 lore higher. Well, can I then quest and force them to challenge me? Because now I'm getting ahead and I might start pulling away, right? Especially if I then play a 3/4, a 3-cost 3/4. And they're like, well, I can't just quest because then my opponent can challenge and their character will remain. So I better challenge into their 3/3/2 lore, trade them, and at least then, I've gotten 1-for-1 card parity and I'm not falling behind in cards, right? The more that you can force your opponent to have to challenge you, the better off you'll be. But if they're ahead and they're the quester and you try to force them to challenge you, they're just going to ignore you. They're going to ignore what you've played and only take favorable challenges and just keep questing away because they're the true quester and you've just, quested in a poor way, right? So if the tables are reversed and they've got the 3/3/2 lore and they're 3 lore ahead and they quest and you've got your 3/3/2 lore and that's your only option is to challenge or quest, right? Then you better challenge and remove that character because if you quest, they can just ignore you and they maintain the lead, right? So knowing who is the quester and who should be questing and who should be challenging is a key element of the gameplay. All right, let's go back to that cost curve. So as we're talking about gameplay, we want to think about the mulligan. Cost curve and inkability both come in here, right? Now the mulligan, when we're used to consistent deck sync constructed. I'm used to having 4 of most cards in my deck. So you mulligan 4 certain cards. You can't do that in limited. You may have a bomb in your deck, but you can't be mulliganing for it. It's 1 out of 40. The chances of you drawing it are relatively slim. So what you should be doing is thinking about who's the quester, am I on the play or on the draw, and trying to curve out effectively, right? Having a 1 drop at hand if you're on the play so that you can go 1 into 2 into 3 into 4, ideally into 5, right? If you can have all 5 lined up and they're relatively aggressive, maybe not all of them, but a few of them at least, right? Then you're in a good state. Even on the draw, you probably want to have a 1 drop ready because if your opponent goes 1 into 2 into 3 into 4 and your first play isn't until turn 3, you've already lost, right? So having 1 into 2 into 3 into 4 into 5 potentially, but usually I'm not greedy. Usually I try to have 1 through 3. If I can get 1 through 4, great, but I try to have 1 through 3. And I want to have characters typically that are relative to what my strategy is probably going to be, which is, again, if I'm on the play, I'd want to try and be more aggressive. If I'm on the draw, I want to try and be more controlling, right? Same with inkability, right? If you've pushed it on the inkability front and you've got 6 to 8 uninkables, then you can't just be looking for the best cards, right? If I only have, if my 1, 2, 3 aren't particularly good, but at least they're inkable, you might have to consider keeping those because if you ship some of those away and then you just get a 3 uninkables back and you don't have a good enough curve and you all of a sudden got to start inking the cards you'd rather not ink and not playing cards on certain turns because you've got all these uninkables stuck in your hand, that's problematic. This is why I often talk about if I'm going to have a lot of uninkables, I at least want them to be lower cost so I can get them out of my hand. If you've got a lot of high cost uninkables stuck in your hand, that can be really problematic. So you need to mulligan with the thought of having that ideal cost curve, 1 through 3 or 4, most of the time, 5 if you've drawn exceptionally, right? And relative to what your style is going to be or your gameplay strategy for that game. And then inkability, you got to try not to be greedy if you've gone high on the inkability, but if you've gone low on the uninkability, then great, you can be a little bit more aggressive with your mulligan. In terms of the functionality, chances are you're going to want predominantly characters. You may have a really good action, but if you don't have characters to control the board to play that action, I think about Finders Keepers in Shimmering Skies. People were all about Finders Keepers, right? Oh, I get to draw 3 in limited. That's amazing. Well, that's great, but if you haven't played turns 1 through 4 to control the board, by the time you get to 5, if you're spending the whole turn drawing 3 cards, you've already lost, right? If your opponent's playing well and they've played relatively aggressively. So those actions can be really impactful, but if you keep it in your opening hand and you don't have a good curve below that, you're going to be in real problems, right? So making sure that you balance the functionality with what you need out of your deck in those early turns. I'd rather ship a card away that might be good, but would be bad at the time that I've got it in my hand and hope to draw it later and risk not drawing it at all, than to keep it in my hand, potentially have it clog up my hand and make it so that I'm not impacting the board. Impacting the board, whether it be with characters or actions that affect characters, is really important, right? Cards that just draw cards, cards that, aren't impactful to the strategy you're trying to do. Again, that 1/2 lore when your opponent's the quester and you need big bodies is not affecting the board. That's not good enough, right? So you need to make sure that you're mulliganing accordingly, and the same with that balance of aggro and control. Now, a few questions that I got that I'd like to answer to this point. Some of it is around when you're going through the gameplay, can I afford to ink for example, my 3-cost 4/3 because I've got I want to be controlling the board. So a 3-cost 4/3 seems good for that, but I've got a better 3-drop. And in my hand, I've got a 4-cost 4/4. Can I afford to do that? How far behind are we, right? Is my opponent really getting aggressive? In which case, I need both that 3-cost 4/3 and that 4-cost 4/4. I need both of them out. I might have, a 3-cost evasive 2 lore, right? I think about Archimedes, right? I think in Shimmering Skies again. I play a lot of Shimmering Skies, right? Great 3-drop. But if my opponent's really getting aggressive on me, almost useless. So then I want the 3-cost 4/3 and the 3-cost 4/4. But if my opponent's maybe on 3 lore at that point, and it doesn't look like they're going to get past, maybe 5 or 6 the following turn, and I've got maybe a 2-drop that can at least control a little bit of the board, okay, then maybe I can afford to do that, right? So where you are relative to what your opponent's doing, how far behind are you getting? Because in limited, because there's so little removal, it's really challenging. If you let them get to, 15, 16, 17 lore, there's a good chance that they can just, keep playing a character every turn and just win before you can do anything. Again, we're used to consistent decks in Constructed, and we just don't have that consistency in Limited. So you really need to control the board early to make sure you hold them to 8, 10, 11, 12 lore before you start taking over if you're on the controlling side. Again, if you're on the aggressive side, that's different. Another question was how not to fall to hyper aggro. I've alluded to that with the balance of aggro and control and being able to pivot to control, but specifically, characters that have higher willpower than strength are typically your answer to a degree, which is to say, those 2-cost 2/3s, those 3-cost 4/4, or 3-cost 3/4s, right? Those are great cards for early game to control the board, right? If I play a 1-cost 2/2, right? Those vanillas, that's why I like them. If I play one of those, my opponent's going first. They play, a 1/3 turn 1. I play my 1-cost 2/2. They play a 2-cost 2/2 2 lore. They may get to quest with that one time, but then I get to trade with it with my 1-drop, right? Great. Or then I play a 2-cost 2/3, and then they feel bad about questing with it at all because they quest with their 2/2. I challenge in with my 2/3. They got 2 lore out of it, but my 2/3 remains on the board. Now it's a 2/1, but, right? Unless I can heal it in some way, right? My character stays on the board to maybe trade with another one of their characters. Maybe they got a 2-cost or a 3-cost 3/2 2 lore or something like that. It's not a common vanilla body, but there is still used to having it on the board. Right? So this is where you can control things a little bit more, right? They play a turn 3 3-cost 3/3 2 lore. You play a 3/4 1 lore. right? You can again challenge into their character and yours stays on the board. The more that you can do this, getting that card advantage through bodies, right? Card advantage, we often think of cards that draw cards, not surprisingly. But card advantage also comes from my 3/4 takes out your 3/3 and remains on the board, right? To then trade with your 4/3 or whatever the case may be, right? If I can trade my character twice for 2 of yours, that's where I get value from, right? So you do that in the early game so that by the time you get to the late game, they're still dropping, 2-cost 2/2 lures, and you're now upgraded to a 4-cost 4/5 2-lure bodyguard, right? Something like that. The last one that I want to talk about is synergies. I've talked about this many times, and I'm sorry for all of you that want to make these work, right? You want to make the princess synergy work. You want to make the racer synergy work. You want to make the location synergy work, right? Most of the time, it just doesn't happen. There are times where there is enough density of cards to make it happen, but what you want to do is draft good cards first. And then if there's like, okay, things are even in a vacuum, or they're close enough where maybe I can take this synergy card, then we can talk, right? But if you outweigh one card because of a synergy far more than another card, that's just not going to see you successful. So think about, 2 sets ago, the ally synergies, right? There was a metric ton of allies and a ton of good allies. So if I'm drafting good cards already that happen to be allies, then all of a sudden I can maybe prioritize ally synergies a little bit, right? But I think of even the Azurite Sea, the pirate synergies. There just wasn't enough good pirates for most of the time the pirate synergy to ever work. There was a lot of bad pirates that would occasionally be good cards when combined with other pirates, but there just wasn't enough of them, and so you just ended up playing bad cards. The chances are with your synergies, you're not going to draw them, or you're not going to draw them in the right order, or, I just lost this character that I needed last turn that would have been great with this character that I drew this turn. But it's too late, that character is gone now, right? So synergies tend to be a trap much more often than not, so don't fall for them. Let your opponents try and do the synergy thing, and you just beat them with straight value. That's all I've got to say for now. I might try and revisit this each set to try and narrow it down, tighten it up, but hopefully you enjoyed these tips and tricks. Hopefully this will help you in winning your next draft. Love to hear your feedback. This is the first time that I've approached a conversation like this on my channel, so would love to hear your thoughts below. Please share it out. If you love Limited, if you want to get more excitement with it in your community, please share it out so more people can appreciate it. I know you want to win every time, so you want to be the only one that has these secrets. But the fact of the matter is, the more people see success in their play or feel like they're playing well, the more likely they're going to want to play that thing. So the more that you can help your friends and family and your community do well in Limited and play well in Limited, the more likely they're going to want to play. And you can keep challenging each other, keep getting better, and keep playing and have full draft pods, right? Thank you all so much again. I really, really appreciate you. We're pretty much wrapped up for this set. I don't know if this will be coming in before or after my quick tips video, but if you haven't seen the quick tips video, you'll check that out where I just kind of summarize the best cards from each of the ink costs from the review videos that I did. If I've already done that, go check it out. If I haven't, check it out tomorrow. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.